Hey, it's Naomi, your script consultant and screenwriting teacher. Today we're going to take a look at the 9 elements that form the foundation of a screenplay. These are the 9 things I cover in the Screenplay Jump Start guide, which you have a link to in your email. That guide describes each of these foundation building elements, so if you're looking for definitions, that's where you'll find them. But I think theory is only useful if you can actually put it into practice, and my goal is always to turn theory into tools you can actually use to build your stories and write stronger screenplays. If you have a tool but you don't know what it does, then it's not much help to you, right? So in this video, we're going to look at the 9 foundation elements in action. And you might be asking, why do we even care about these elements? They're things you already know. And yes, you probably are already well aware of these things, especially if you've written a screenplay or read any screenwriting books. But even though that's the case, it's also true that so many of the notes screenwriters get on their completed screenplays can be traced right back to the foundation of the story. That's one of the reasons I decided to put all of these together in one spot in the Screenplay Jumpstart Guide. It contains all the basics you need to help you build the foundation of your story, and it includes a spot where you can keep it all together and reference it during your development and writing process. And to show you how they form the foundation of the screenplay and the movie, we're going to look at each of the elements in the movie Hidden Figures. So Hidden Figures was directed by Ted Melfi and written by Ted Melfi and Allison Schroeder. It's based on the nonfiction book of the same name by Margot Lee Shetterly, and it's about Black female mathematicians who worked at NASA during the space race of the 1960s. We'll look at the foundation elements in the same order they're covered in the Screenplay Jumpstart Guide, so you can follow along if you want, or you can just stick with me here. And the first element is a main character. Our main character in this movie is Katherine Goebel, played by Taraji P. Henson. All 3 hidden figures are important in this movie, but she's our main protagonist. And one way we can tell this is because she's the one who has the ability to bring about the story's outcome. If we looked at the other 2 ladies who are featured, Octavia Spencer and Janelle Monáe, Octavia Spencer's actions in the story all revolve around becoming a supervisor at NASA, and Janelle Monáe's story revolves around becoming an engineer. Both important things, but Taraji's story is about figuring out the math that will get men safely into orbit and back again, which is what the movie is centered around. This story is all about how important these hidden figures were to NASA, but in particular, how important Katherine Goebel was to that particular mission. And, a story can be told from any number of perspectives. This one could have been, it could have focused on another of those mathematicians. So why did the writers choose Katherine as the center? If you think about it, she's the most closely connected to the event of John Glenn's launch, and using that particular launch as part of the spine of the story helps give this story urgency. If the story had focused on either of the other 2 women, even though their goals are important and meaningful historically, there isn't a lot of urgency associated with either one. We'll talk about this more in a second, but I just wanted to point out that even who the protagonist of the story is, although it might seem obvious in hindsight, it is a deliberate choice by the writer in order to build the strongest version of the story in the screenplay. Okay, so element 2 is a goal. What specific external goal is the focus of the story? Remember, the pursuit of this goal is what moves the plot, and Katherine is one of the best number crunchers at NASA. There's an opening in, the elite team for someone with her skills. So by the end of the first act, which is when the goal should be established, we understand how important it is to Katherine, to her community, and to her family for her to succeed in that new job. And that job is to help the Space Task Group, that's the elite team, complete their launch successfully. So that's her new job. In the first act, she gets this new position, and we see how difficult it's going to be for her, and we see how important it is to her. It's really pairing her personal mission and the stakes, which we'll talk about in a second, with the very concrete external goal of the team that gives this story its solid shape. And again, that's just pointing out that the design of this story is built on the writer's deliberate choice of this goal. If they had gone with something else, say if they had gone with Katherine just, striving to get a permanent job with the space task group, or maybe if they had gone with one of the other women as the central figure. None of these things, would have the same urgency and scope or stakes of the John Glenn launch. So all of this is just to point out again that this story design with this goal at the center of it, it didn't happen by chance. These are deliberate choices by the writer, and these are the kinds of things to be thinking about and questioning when you're designing the foundation of your own story. So the third element is strong opposition. And the main force of antagonism for Catherine is the institutional racism. So her goal is difficult on its own, but Catherine is brilliant and capable, which we know early on in the movie. What's really getting in her way of achieving that goal isn't the difficulty of the goal itself. It's the way the world operates at this time. There's a generalized inability to see what's wrong with the status quo and instead to accept things the way they are, which is in a state of prejudice and inequality. Catherine's supervisor, Vivian, played by Kirsten Dunst, makes this point when she says, "They've never had a black person in here before, Catherine. Don't embarrass me." So she's really putting a fine point on that conflict that's at the center of this story. Once Catherine starts her new position, we see the way she's treated really as a second-class citizen because she's the only black member of the team. And these social forces are embodied in the head engineer at Catherine's new job, Paul Stafford, played by Jim Parsons. He actively stands in Catherine's way of achieving her goal. But even his motivations are grounded in the institutional racism, so he's really an extension of, or the face of, that big force of antagonism. And that's another key thing to note and to pay attention to when you're figuring out these foundational pieces for yourself. Usually the more you can draw connections between the elements, the more of a cohesive feeling your script will have. And you want that cohesive feeling. Everything in your movie should feel of a piece, and it should feel as though you, the writer, have chosen these particular puzzle pieces to create one intentional big picture. So if you're following along in the guide, we stop here for a quick logline break. Since we've now covered all the basics you need in a logline, it's the who, the main character, wants what, the goal, and what's standing in her way, which is the opposition. Putting these three elements together and then tweaking the language a little, we'd probably have something like: a brilliant but undervalued black female mathematician in 1960s segregated Virginia struggles against institutional racism to become a vital and valued part of the team responsible for launching John Glenn into orbit at the height of the space race. So there's your logline. On to the rest of our foundational elements. Number 4 is actions. What do we see the protagonist do in order to get the goal? And, early on, you're not breaking down the plot into pieces that are too small, but you do want to be able to think about the sort of gist of the action, a big picture sense of it, so that you know what kinds of things are going to happen in your movie. And it also helps prompt you to think about whether or not there is enough that can happen in your movie, right? Do you have enough conflict to work with? Is there enough for the protagonist to do to sort of build an entire movie on? So in this movie, we spend the movie watching Catherine try to contribute to her team's mission, despite a pervasive belief that she's less than, and she's being treated in a way that makes the day-to-day harder for her than for everyone else on her team. So the deck is really stacked against her, right? Despite that, we see her outshine the others, rising to the challenge to innovate and think differently about the problem in order to find an effective solution. So basically, we see her apply her brilliant mind to the problem of launching John Glenn into orbit and come up with a successful solution by looking at it differently. We see, exactly how smart she is by the way she takes a unique approach to the math of it all, right? And we see her do this while contending with the problem of institutional racism, and ultimately she manages to get the people around her to see things differently and make changes at NASA. So those two sides of it really mirror each other and complement each other nicely. The way she's approaching the math in a unique and unprecedented way, and that's reflected in the way sort of society is changing around her. The people around her are starting to see the problem of institutional racism in a new way, or to see it at all, really. Okay, so the fifth element is stakes. What happens if the main character fails to achieve the goal? If Catherine fails in this new position, she will have proved that she doesn't belong there. She's the first African American to hold this position, and if she fails, she will be the last. On top of that, it's a very real possibility that the launch won't happen, or that the astronauts will die in space if they don't get the calculations right. So, ultimately, if the stakes are, if Catherine fails, she'll have let herself, her family, and her community down. And those are the more personal stakes, but the goal also carries meaning for society as a whole and life or death stakes for individuals, those astronauts. So all of that together, that's a great combination of stakes that are really powerful and help us invest in the character and in her success. So, we're really rooting for her because there's so much riding on her achieving the goal and pursuing the goal in this story. Sixth element is genre and tone. What does the movie feel like? And why do you need to think about genre and tone at all, right? As I wrote in the guide, confused or uneven tone is a pretty common problem in early drafts, and that's understandable. A lot of times first drafts are exploratory drafts, but thinking about genre and tone now in the planning stages gives you a touchstone to help you, to help keep you on target as you're writing. So what are the genre and tone of Hidden Figures? For genre, I'd say light drama. Even though it deals with some serious issues, it also has humor and an uplifting message. And for tone, I'd say the mix of positive or inspirational message and humor with the drama makes it compare well to movies like The Help, Saving Mr. Banks, and The Blind Side. So if I were writing this movie, those are the three that I would have as my touchstones throughout the process. And I think it's helpful to have touchstones throughout the process so you can sort of remind yourself what you're aiming for. Okay, so changed worldview and initial worldview. I'm going to cover these two together because they really only work together. The initial worldview and changed worldview are the point A and point Z of the character arc. They're the before and after pictures of the character's transformation. And in this story, it's really the people about, around Catherine who change the most, which is, it's less common in movies, but it's not at all uncommon for the world to change more than the character. And you can see how it makes sense for this story. It's the world that needs to change more than the protagonist. Even so, the writers gave Catherine a subtle character arc. And if we look at the before and after pictures, it's easier to see and identify that change. So in the beginning of the story, Catherine is very much a don't make waves kind of person. She may not like the way things are, but she accepts them. We see this in contrast to her friends, in particular Mary, who is played by Janelle Monáe, who's not in this picture. She's sort of in the corner there, but her character is more outspoken and defiant, and it provides a nice contrast for us to see that Catherine isn't those things. And a great example of the way of sort of the characterization at the beginning of the movie is the bathroom situation. In the first half of the movie, Catherine runs across campus to use the restroom every day, rather than bringing the situation to anyone's attention. To tie it into the theme, she accepts herself and her struggles being overlooked or hidden. As the story progresses, we see her begin to speak out about the injustices she's experiencing. And then finally, toward the third act, Catherine is, a big change has occurred in her, actually. She's putting her name on reports even though Stafford tells her not to. And she's talking to her big boss, played by Kevin Costner, into letting her attend top security clearance meetings, which is totally unprecedented. And she's speaking up for herself, pushing back against the way things are, and questioning the status quo. And we can see the marked difference in her. Okay, so I would say by the end of the movie, there's a clear sense that her own estimation of her worth and her value to NASA has changed. That's her personal arc. And as I mentioned before, in this story, we also see changes in the world around her, but I wanted to really just point out the character's arc in this video today. So our last element is the climax, and the climax is the main character's final confrontation with the primary obstacle. It's where the outcome of the story is determined, whether or not the goal is achieved. And if you remember, Catherine's main story goal was to succeed in her new position, which involves helping the Space Task Group to complete a successful launch. Um, in the movie, the day of the launch, Catherine is back with her old colleagues watching the launch. Discrepancies arise in the calculations for the capsule's landing coordinates, and John Glenn requests Catherine specifically to be called in to check them. She works her magic and runs the calculations over to the control room, but when she delivers the results, she's not allowed in. The door is literally slammed in her face, and so it's like nothing has changed. Her antagonist, which again is the racism of the day, it's winning in that moment, right? So then her boss, Kevin Costner, brings her into the room personally so they can relay the results to John Glenn together, showing that maybe things actually have changed. And then we see the rest of the climax play out. After a successful launch and orbit, the space capsule has a heat shield problem. Their entire mission is at risk. Those stakes that we talked about earlier of John Glenn's life, they're coming to bear. And Catherine suggests a solution on the fly, which works miraculously, and John Glenn is able to land safely. So in this climax, we see Catherine prove she's vital to the team, and she's valued for her contribution and treated as an equal. The team completes its launch successfully, so the climax here checks all the boxes. It answers all the questions that are posed in the setup and shows us the change that's happened. It's really the culmination of all those other elements we talked about. All these foundation elements, show up here, and they're all connected, and they all pay off. So that's it. All 9 of the elements covered in the Screenplay Jumpstart Guide in the wild. They're the elements that create the strong foundation that everything else in your screenplay builds on. And that's why we want to think about these things early on in the process and then keep referencing and checking in on them throughout the process. I hope you've enjoyed this video. You can find more videos and articles about screenwriting at the Wright & Company website. And if you have questions about anything we've covered today or about screenwriting in general, email me anytime. My website and email address are right there on the screen. And I can't wait to hear from you. Thanks.